dark remittance. The signal that opened everything came from a radio frequency that should not have been active. NSA Cyber operates persistent spectrum monitoring across a wide range of frequency bands in regions of sustained intelligence interest. Most of what that monitoring produces is routine: commercial traffic, civilian communications, the ordinary electromagnetic noise of populated areas doing ordinary things. Analysts are trained to recognize routine. They are trained, more importantly, to recognize what falls outside of it. A radio frequency transmitting on a band associated with military-grade communications equipment, originating from a location in the Sonora highlands of northwestern Mexico where no military-grade equipment had any reason to be, was not routine. It was the kind of anomaly that an experienced signals analyst marks, logs, and watches. Because in NSA Cyber's operational experience, unexplained signals in unexpected places rarely stay unexplained for long. The frequency was first flagged on a Monday morning. By Thursday of the same week, it had transmitted 4 more times. By the following Monday, the collection team assigned to characterize the signal had established that the transmissions were not random. They were scheduled. They followed a timing pattern that suggested deliberate, coordinated communication between at least 2 parties: a sender at the Sonora Highlands origin point, and 1 or more receivers at locations that the signal's propagation characteristics suggested were geographically distributed across a range extending from northern Mexico into Central America. NSA Cyber brought in radio frequency analysis specialists. The transmission protocol was identified within 2 weeks as a modified version of a high-frequency radio communication system that had historical associations with state-level military and intelligence communications in the Middle East. The modification was sophisticated. The base protocol had been altered in ways designed to make it appear to standard monitoring systems as degraded commercial traffic or atmospheric noise. It was not commercial traffic. It was not atmospheric noise. It was a deliberately obscured communications channel being operated by someone who understood both the base protocol and how to disguise it. The question of how a communications system with historical associations to Middle Eastern state military infrastructure had come to be operating on a scheduled basis from the Sonora highlands of Mexico required an answer. NSA Cyber's analytical division began constructing that answer while the technical teams continued developing the signal collection. Parallel monitoring of cellular and satellite phone infrastructure in the same geographic region produced a secondary thread. A cluster of prepaid satellite phone handsets operating in the Sonora highlands showed communication patterns consistent with the timing of the radio frequency transmissions. Not identical, but correlated. The satellite phones appeared to be used for coordination immediately before and after radio transmissions, suggesting a layered communications architecture in which the satellite phones handled local coordination, while the radio frequency system handled the long-distance traffic that the satellite phones were being used to prepare. Taken together, the radio frequency system and the satellite phone cluster described a communications infrastructure that was operationally sophisticated, deliberately obscured, and actively in use. The question was, in use for what? The answer took 4 months to develop fully. NSA Cyber's cryptographic resources worked the radio frequency transmission content in parallel with the satellite phone traffic analysis. The radio frequency transmissions were encrypted with a system that the technical team's initial assessment rated as significantly more complex than standard commercial or criminal encryption. It bore characteristics consistent with state-developed cryptographic protocols, adapted and modified for use outside of state infrastructure. Breaking it required 7 months of sustained effort, during which the collection operation continued accumulating transmissions that would eventually be decrypted retroactively once the encryption was broken. When the decryption succeeded, the retroactive decoding of 14 months of accumulated transmissions produced an intelligence picture that NSA Cyber's senior analytical staff described in internal assessments As one of the most significant signals intelligence developments in the Western Hemisphere operational portfolio in years, the radio frequency communications documented an operational partnership between two organizations that had not previously been identified as directly connected in any NSA Cyber case file. On one side of the partnership was a financial and logistics network operating under the umbrella of a Sinaloa region cartel faction. Not the primary cartel command structure, but a semi-autonomous sub-organization that controlled specific territorial and financial assets in northwestern Mexico and maintained independent relationships with external partners. On the other side was a unit that the decoded messages identified through a series of internal designators that NSA Cyber analysts, after cross-referencing with existing intelligence holdings, assessed with high confidence as connected to Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps financial and external operations infrastructure. The partnership's operational purpose, as documented in 14 months of decoded transmissions, was the construction, financing, and supply of a network of what the decoded messages explicitly called operational support cells. Structured groups of individuals embedded in 6 countries across Central and South America, with a primary concentration in Venezuela, Paraguay, Brazil, and Guatemala. The cells had been established over a period of approximately 3 years prior to the period covered by the decoded transmissions, meaning the full operational history of the network extended back approximately 4.5 years from the point at which NSA Cyber had first detected the anomalous radio frequency. The decoded messages documented the cell's structure and purpose with a level of operational detail that left little analytical ambiguity. Each cell comprised between 8 and 15 individuals operating under a designated coordinator. Cell coordinators communicated with the cartel's side logistics network through encrypted satellite phone channels and received operational guidance, financial transfers, and supply coordination through the cartel's established infrastructure. The cartel's role in the partnership was explicitly logistical and financial. It provided the geographic reach, the established smuggling routes, the document forgery networks, and the cash handling infrastructure that allowed the cells to operate without drawing the attention that direct Iranian state financial transfers would have generated. The Iranian connected unit's role was directional and operational. It provided the cells with their mandates, their targets, their equipment requirements, and their long-term strategic objectives. The decoded transmissions documented that the Iranian connected coordination had been managing the network's strategic direction from outside the Western Hemisphere, using the cartel's communication and logistics infrastructure as the interface layer between its own operations and the cells embedded in Latin American countries. The scale of what 14 months of decoded transmissions revealed was, by any measure, extraordinary. The network comprised 7 active operational cells across 6 countries, with a total identified membership of 94 individuals in active roles and an additional estimated 60 to 80 support and facilitation contacts. The cells had received, over the documented period, financial transfers totaling approximately $47 million, routed through the cartel's cash handling network in ways that made the funds appear as proceeds from legitimate commercial activity. Supply shipments documented in decoded logistics coordination messages included communications equipment, surveillance hardware, and, in 3 specific cases described in detail in transmissions between the cartel logistics coordinator and cell-level recipients, weapons components that the analytical team assessed as consistent with materials used in the construction of improvised explosive devices. The decoded transmissions documented that the cells had been conducting what the messages called preparation activities across their areas of operation. The term covered a range of activities that NSA Cyber analysts reconstructed from context and specifics. Physical surveillance of identified facilities, including diplomatic premises, commercial infrastructure of U.S. connected companies, and transportation nodes. the establishment of document and identity cover arrangements for individuals who would need to move across borders without detection, the mapping and assessment of local security response capabilities and timing, and the development of what the messages called activation packages, documented operational plans for specific actions that would be executed upon receipt of an activation instruction from the Iranian-connected coordination unit. The activation packages themselves were referenced, but not fully transmitted in the decoded messages. Their specific contents were held in separate storage by the cell coordinators and had not been transmitted over the radio frequency network. What the decoded messages did document was the preparation process, the surveillance work, the logistics arrangements, the personnel movements, and a series of scheduling discussions that made clear that the network was approaching a point of operational readiness that its coordinators considered significant. The timeline trigger arrived in a decoded transmission exchange that took place over 3 days in the 6th week following the initial decryption breakthrough. The Iranian-connected coordination unit transmitted a series of messages to the Cartel logistics node that were subsequently relayed to cell coordinators in Venezuela, Paraguay, and Guatemala. The messages used scheduling language that NSA Cyber analysts, reviewing them in the context of the full 14 months of decoded operational history, assessed as an activation preparation sequence, a series of coordination steps that the network's own internal messaging had previously described as the final phase before operational deployment. The decoded messages specified a coordination window of 18 days. Within that window, cell coordinators were directed to confirm personnel readiness, verify supply inventories, establish the communication protocols that would be used during active operations, and report final activation readiness to the Cartel logistics coordinator for relay to the Iranian-connected unit. The 18-day window would close on a specific date that the decoded messages referenced as the confirmation deadline. NSA Cyber escalated the full intelligence package immediately. The breadth of the threat, multiple cells across multiple countries with indications of imminent activation, required a multi-agency, multinational response on a scale that demanded the earliest possible notification to relevant partners. The FBI's Counterterrorism Division received the complete analytical package within 6 hours of the timeline assessment being finalized. The CIA's Western Hemisphere operations was read in simultaneously given the foreign operational dimensions. The State Department's Diplomatic Security Service was notified through appropriate channels regarding the specific threats to diplomatic facilities documented in the cell's surveillance activities. DHS and the DEA were brought in for the cartel infrastructure dimensions of the operation. International law enforcement and intelligence partners in Venezuela, Paraguay, Brazil, and Guatemala were engaged through established liaison channels. The sensitivity of the source intelligence required careful management. Partner agencies received actionable location and personnel information derived from the NSA Cyber decryption without being provided details of the collection method itself. Protecting the continued viability of the signal's collection capability, which remained active and productive throughout the operational response planning period, was a priority that shaped how partner agencies were briefed. The operational response plan that the multi-agency task force developed over 11 days addressed 3 simultaneous objectives. The first was the disruption of the cell network itself. Raids on identified cell locations, arrests of identified cell members, and seizure of operational materials, including the activation packages that cell coordinators had been holding in physical storage. The second was the disruption of the cartel logistics infrastructure that had been serving as the network's financial and communications backbone in the Western Hemisphere. The third was the collection of maximum forensic and intelligence value from every location and individual encountered in the operational phase. Documentation, devices, financial records, and personnel information that would extend the investigation's reach beyond the identified network into the broader infrastructure it had connected to. The coordinated operations began on a Thursday, 14 days after the decoded timeline messages had established the 18-day confirmation window, leaving 4 days of buffer before the deadline the decoded transmissions had specified. In Venezuela, national security forces acting on NSA Cyber-derived location intelligence conducted simultaneous operations against 3 identified cell locations in the Caracas metropolitan area and 1 location in the Valencia region. The operations recovered 23 individuals connected to the cell network, significant quantities of surveillance documentation including photographs and mapping materials of diplomatic and commercial facilities, communications equipment consistent with the hardware described in decoded supply coordination messages, and physical documents that investigators subsequently assessed as containing components of 2 activation packages. 3 individuals identified as cell coordinators were among those detained. In Paraguay, law enforcement operations against 2 identified cell locations in the Asunción area and 1 location in Ciudad del Este recovered 17 individuals, additional surveillance documentation, and financial records that gave investigators a significantly more detailed picture of the cash routing methods the network had been using to move funds from cartel side handlers to cell-level operations. In Guatemala, operations against a single identified cell location in the Guatemala City area recovered 9 individuals and materials including communications devices and a partially completed activation package that provided investigators with their most complete view of what the network's operational plans had actually contained. In Mexico, coordinated operations involving U.S. federal agencies and Mexican law enforcement targeted the cartel logistics infrastructure that had been managing the network's Western Hemisphere backbone. Raids at 4 locations in Sonora and Sinaloa resulted in 34 arrests, including 2 individuals who decoded communications identified as senior coordinators of the cartel-side logistics operation. The radio frequency transmission equipment that had been operating from the Sonora Highlands location was seized. Financial documentation recovered from cartel-side locations included records of approximately $47 million in transfer activity, consistent with the financial flows documented in decoded transmissions. The total operational results across all 4 countries included 83 arrests, the seizure of activation package materials from 3 of the 7 identified cells, the recovery of surveillance documentation targeting 14 specific facilities across 4 countries, the dismantling of the cartel logistics network that had served as the operation's Western Hemisphere infrastructure, and the seizure of communications equipment that gave investigators additional forensic access to the network's historical operational record. The 4-day buffer before the decoded timeline's confirmation deadline proved significant. Post-operational analysis of recovered materials, cross-referenced with continued NSA Cyber monitoring of the network's now disrupted communications infrastructure, indicated that at least 2 of the 7 cells had been approaching genuine activation readiness at the time the operations began. The activation packages recovered from the Guatemala and Venezuela locations documented planned actions against specific facilities that, had they been executed, would have resulted in casualties among diplomatic and civilian personnel. The 94 identified active cell members, reduced to 83 following arrests in 4 countries, had spent years building toward an operational deployment that the organizations directing them believed was protected by communications infrastructure sophisticated enough to be impenetrable. The cartel logistics network that had provided that infrastructure's Western Hemisphere layer had operated for years on the assumption that the radio frequency system it was using to communicate with its Iranian-connected partners was invisible to collection capabilities. NSA Cyber's 7-month decryption effort demonstrated the limits of that assumption. 14 months of transmissions that their senders believed were permanently encrypted were decoded, analyzed, and acted upon before the network's operational timeline could close. The facilities that the cells had been surveilling and documenting for years. The diplomatic premises, the commercial infrastructure, the transportation nodes that appeared in photograph after photograph recovered from cell locations, were intact. The personnel who worked in those facilities went about their Thursday without knowing that the 14 months of preparation that had been directed at the places where they worked had been intercepted, documented, and dismantled 4 days before the deadline that would have mattered. Signal intelligence is, at its foundation, about the gap between what people believe and what is true. The network that built the Southern financial architecture, that recruited and positioned 94 individuals across 6 countries, that moved $47 million through cartel cash channels and constructed activation packages for actions that would have changed lives in ways those lives did not deserve. That network believed it was operating in the silence of unreadable communications. NSA Cyber had been reading for 7 months. The silence was never real. What the radio frequency was carrying from the Sonora highlands across 14 months of scheduled transmissions was a complete operational record of something that should not have existed in the Western Hemisphere. It is no longer operating. The transmissions have stopped. The cells have been disrupted. The activation packages are in federal evidence storage. The signal was found. The signal was read. The signal told NSA Cyber everything it needed to know. This is a fictional dramatization inspired by signal intelligence and cyber operations concepts. No real cases, individuals, specific methods, or NSA operations are depicted. All characters, organizations, operational details, events, and geopolitical scenarios described are entirely fictitious and are used solely for narrative and illustrative purposes.